In the last section, we spoke about how we can use the range syntax with a slice to split a slice into two. So let's start writing some code. Let's put together this deal function. I'm going to change on over to my code editor and find the deck.go file. I'll scroll on down to the bottom where I'm going to define this new deal function. Now I want to start thinking about the parameters of this function. Like, what's the signature of this function look like? As we've said, we expect to call this deal function with an existing list of cards, which we'll refer to as dDeck. As a second argument, we're going to list out the number of cards that we want to have in the hand that we're going to return. And we'll call that maybe the hand size, int. Now this is the first time that we've ever used arguments inside of a function call. Even though it's the first time, I bet you're kind of getting a familiar sense of what this function signature is really looking like. This is saying that we can call this deal function with a first argument of type deck and a second argument of type int. We cannot call the deal function with any other types whatsoever. So if we did something like deal and pass in a string of blah 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 and a second argument of 1, this would throw an error message because we are trying to call the deal function with a first argument of type string rather than of type deck. Now right before the type in both these arguments right here, we list out the variable name that this will be received as inside the function. So if we did something like, say, fmt print line d, we would see an output of our entire deck object or our entire deck slice right here. Again, you're seeing this kind of one character or very short abbreviated syntax, or variable name I should say, for the argument. So we're calling this specifically d because this is convention. I know calling a thing with a one-letter variable is going to be confusing at some point in time, but again, that is convention here. Because if we call this thing what it really is, deck, well, now it's really confusing. Does deck talk about the deck type or the actual instance or copy of the deck variable? So instead, we'll go with D. If you want to, you can always call this something like cards. That kind of adds a little bit of clarity, or at least a little bit more, I would say, but then it kind of turns into a little bit of confusion because we're talking about cards and we're talking about a deck. Life starts to get a little confusing. Okay, so inside of here, we're going to take this list of cards right here, this deck, and we're going to split it into two using the hand size. Now, the other thing we have to do on the function signature is think about exactly what we are returning from this function. And so we've said many times, kind of in the last video, that we want to take that starting deck, this kind of input deck up here, and we want to split it into two separate slices, both of which should still be of type deck. And so it sounds to me like we want to return two separate values from this function, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So Go has support for returning multiple values from one function. Over here on the right-hand side of the argument list, where we usually specify or annotate our return type, we're going to add a set of parentheses, and then inside of here, we're going to tell Go that we expect to return two separate values from this function, and they are both going to be of type deck. So we'll write deck, comma, deck. So that right there tells Go that we're going to return two values, and they are both going to be of type deck. So now inside of here, we can use that range syntax with our slice d to split it into two. So we'll say return d, everything from the start of the slice to hand size. So that's going to be this kind of the hand that we're forming up right here. And we're saying give me everything from the start of the slice to index of 1 less than the hand size. And then the second value we're going to return, which will be separated by a comma right here, will be everything in the deck from the hand size to the very end. So notice how we've got a colon right here with nothing before it, and on the other one we have a colon with nothing after it. So this is a great example of two separate return values inside of one function. We can return two separate values and simply split them by a comma. The one thing to keep in mind is to annotate the actual return types so that Go expects two separate values to be returned. Okay, so let's test this out inside of our main.go file. I'm going to make sure that I save the deck.go file. When I do not see any typos or anything like that here, so I think we're okay. I'm going to flip back over to main.go, and we're going to take that cards thing that we produced right here, And we're going to use the deal function to split it into two. Now, we haven't really looked at this yet, but you'll notice that we have defined the deal function over in deck.go. Now, we do not have to do any import statements or anything like that to get access to that deal function. We can just freely call it because that function is declared in the same package. So we're going to call deal, we'll pass in our list of cards, and then as a second argument, we'll specify the hand size. And let's call it a hand size of 5. Now here's the next tricky part. Deal is going to return two separate values. And so we're going to use a little bit of syntax to capture both of the values that get returned. The syntax is actually not really that bad, but I do have a diagram around it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to specify two separate values or two separate variables to receive the two values that deck returns. And so deal right here is going to return a deck and a deck. We're going to take the first deck that gets returned, it'll be assigned to hand, and then the second deck that gets returned, which is the remaining cards inside the deck, will be returned to the second variable that we list over here. So let's try this out. We'll say hand, comma, remaining cards, and then we are initializing and assigning values to these two variables, so we're going to make sure that we use the := operator. Okay, so again, deal returns two values. The first return value will be assigned to hand. The second return value will be assigned to remaining cards. Now do remember that these are both going to be of type deck, because that is what deal is returning. It's returning two values of type deck. All right, now the very last thing I want to do is to print out both of these, which we can do by simply saying hand.print and remaining cards.print. Remember that we can call the print function on both of these values right here because they are both of type deck, and we have set up deck right here to be able to be called with any type, well, I should not any type, but any value with type of deck. That'd be more appropriate to say. Okay, so let's save the file, and now we'll run this code. So I'm going to flip back over to my terminal. We'll do go run main.go and deck.go. And then when we do, we'll see our print statement come out here. Now you'll notice that all the cards still go in a line. So we've got ace 2, 3, 4, ace 2, 3, 4, ace 2, 3, 4. But if you look closely at the index, you'll see that we go index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is the hand right here. And then the index starts over. And this represents all the remaining cards inside the remaining deck, or that second argument or the second value that's coming out of our deal function. So it looks like this is definitely working out correctly. Okay, so that's a great example of multiple return values from one function. Let's take a quick break and continue with our next function in the next section.